Okay, hello and welcome to our third podcast of the Fellowship of Grace PCA podcast in beautiful sunny Peoria, Arizona. And our guest today is Inwoo Lee. Inwoo Lee. Hello, Inwoo. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you, Jonathan?
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today. And could you introduce yourself and perhaps tell however many people are watching this, maybe one or two or three, or well, usually these videos get a few. I don't know, as many as 50 watchers. But maybe this you'll draw on the masses, so maybe we'll double, triple that number this time. So
I don't know about that, but it's called the Underground Podcast, right? The Underground Podcast. Those are the best podcasts, right? The underground. Well,
um,
yeah, yeah. Well, I know Jonathan for about 12 years now. I think in
wow.
2010 we first met at Covenant Presbyterian Church in the Jamshid area, and yeah. So whenever I think about Jonathan Foster, I think about Korea. So when I heard that he moved out to Arizona, I was like, what? I cannot associate Jonathan with another place other than Korea. So yeah,
Yeah.
for me, I was a little bit sad because I just moved out here to Korea and then now he's gone. So
That's okay. I brought the Korea with me, so it's in my heart.
yes. So yeah, just a little bit about myself. My name is Inwoo Lee, and I live here now in Korea with my wife. I'm a Korean American. I used to live in California. Parents were immigrants to America. They immigrated in the 70s. And my wife and I, we work here. We live in the Anyang area. For those who know a little bit about Korea, we're here in Indagon Station, and we go to a church together. It's called Yulin Presbyterian Church, and I teach at a Christian school. I teach Bible and theology to middle school and high school students. So yeah, I think that's my
That's
bio.
very cool. Can you tell me a little about your students? How are they? Good students? Are they interested in the class?
Not all of them, to be honest. Not all of them. They have many classes to go through. I teach Bible twice a week to all of the students at middle school and high school. It's really fun for me, and I hope it is for the students as well.
Yeah.
But you do have some that are interested, though. You know, their
Yeah.
eyes light up according to, when you teach the word, their eyes light up, and you could tell if they're
Wonderful.
interested by the questions. So if they ask questions, wow, that's me. It's really good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you remember any questions they asked you that were interesting or not?
Yeah, some of the questions are personal.
Uh-huh.
Some of them are, theological questions. What I have to do is I have to write these questions down, all the questions that I get over the years.
Mhm.
But one personal question could be like things like, is it okay to in the future marry a non-Christian? I think
Mm.
that's one big issue.
What'd you
And
tell them?
of course not. Got marry Christian, right? I go to 1 Corinthians 7 for that.
Uh-huh.
And then you have other theological questions too, regards to the scriptures, like was Adam saved? Was
Mhm.
Noah saved? Things like that, right? And then you could talk about, covenant, covenant theology, and
Mm.
Genesis 3:15, things like
Okay.
that. So yeah, those type of questions.
Well, neat. Neat. How about, can you tell everyone about your background, your education?
Yeah, I did was a history major at UCSD, and then went to Westminster Seminary to complete historical theology. I wrote my thesis on William Perkins, excuse me. Under
Mhm.
my supervisor was R. Scott Clark,
Mm.
and my second reader was Ryan Glomsrud. So I really thank the Lord for that opportunity to write on the father of Puritanism, right, William Perkins, and
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about him in a bit, but first of all, let's talk a little bit about Christianity in Korea.
Yeah.
So I'll just throw out a general question. What do you think is this? I mean, this is like a $1 million question, but so don't feel like you have to answer every part of it or whatever. But well, what do you think is the state of Christianity in Korea?
I think there's pockets of gospel preaching, pockets of reformed theology. I
Hmm.
think overall, the state of Korean Christianity, I think we discussed this a while ago. I went to
Yeah.
Korea and interviewed Pastor Jay and you
Hmm.
regarding Korean Christianity when I came to visit a few years ago.
Hmm.
I don't think much has changed from that conversation that we had, so
Mm.
there are definitely pockets, definitely.
Yep.
But I think the overall state is that there's a lot of cults here in Korea, and
Hmm.
I think the state of Christianity in Korea is more, uh, more in the imperative form. What I
Mm.
mean by that is, um, living the Christian life, which is really important, but
Mhm.
not really talking too much about doctrine, not talking too much about the gospel and things like that. I'm not saying this is all for all of
Mm.
South Korea, but
Yep.
I
Yep.
think there needs to be more doctrine here. Definitely.
Well, it sounds on that note, it's pretty similar to American Christianity,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, you talked a little bit about the cults. How can you? Oh, what's been your experience with some of the cults in Korea? I mean, what are the some of the groups there, and what do they do or what do they believe?
Yeah. So have not, when I talk with my students at
Hmm.
school, they get people come up to them and talk to them, like Mother of God cult came up to them and talked with them, things like that. But I haven't had that happen to me yet in Korea.
Hmm.
Um, in our apartment complex on the third floor, we had someone who is from the Shincheonji when Corona broke out and things like
Hmm.
that. But I've heard a lot of stories in regards to the Shincheonji. Um, one story, couple stories. It's very interesting because at Yongin Presbyterian Church, we had a Christian news broadcaster who came in to talk
Hmm.
about the different cults, as they were training deacons and stuff, and
Hmm.
he was talking about the different cults, right? And he said he was talking about this thing called the plan scenario. The
Hmm.
plan scenario. This is how they evangelize Shincheonji
Okay.
because Shincheonji is huge, right? It's
Yeah.
like millions of Shincheonji and spreading throughout the world as well.
Yeah.
And one of the stories, this is how one of the stories that they mentioned was there's a college student who converted to Shincheonji, and for many different reasons, she wanted her mother to be converted as well to the Shincheonji cult. So her mother was, owned a restaurant in Seoul,
Mm.
so they do this planned scenario, right?
Mhm.
Where the college student is eating lunch in the restaurant, right?
Mhm.
Then all of a sudden she pretends, right, with her acting skills, she pretends that she has a demon inside of her. So demon possession, right? So she's
Mhm.
convulsing and things like that, right? And then her mom is seeing her, in the restaurant, seeing her convulsing because she has a demon inside of her. And then all of a sudden, a man stands up, in the restaurant, and he's a pastor, right? And
Mm.
he casts out that demon from the daughter, and so the daughter is now fine. And then the rest, her mother starts to, she's very, she starts to calm down because she's hysterical. And
Mhm.
then the pastor says to her, "Hey, this you need to come with me to pray. You need to come to my church,
Mm.
and we need to pray. If you don't, then more things like this will happen, right?"
Mm.
And that's a planned scenario where that pastor was actually a Shincheonji pastor that stood up, right?
Mm.
So they plan these kind of scenarios in Korea, and so they have a pretty big planned out system in regards to that. So yeah, just secondhand, just hearing about these kind of stories, it is prevalent. We have signs in our church. I go to Youngin Presbyterian Church. We have signs in our church that say no Shincheonji allowed here. You know,
Mm-hmm.
because they're not like Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses where but they actually go into the churches and try to take it over. And I think a situation like that happened at Covenant as well. So so those are some direct things in regards to
Yeah.
one in Korea, which
It,
is
it it didn't make it very far, but yeah, there was a pathetic attempt. So
yeah.
yeah. Well, what does Shincheonji believe?
Yeah, so um they Lee Markey would probably be a really good person to go through that.
Yeah.
But some of the things is they one of the main beliefs. You could correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not an expert of Shincheonji, but Jesus is an actual person, right? They believe that Jesus is an actual person in Korea, right? And they have a term for that, right?
Hmm.
And so that's one of the
Yeah.
major.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
was a guy named Iman He, or it is a guy named Iman He, and he's still alive, right? Last time I heard, he was still alive, and he was super old.
Yeah, he apologized for the corona, when there was that crazy corona spreading through the Shincheonji churches. He went out and
Huh.
apologized.
Oh,
Yeah,
so he admitted that he had made a mistake.
yeah, I believe so. Yeah,
Well,
correct me if I'm wrong. But
that's interesting. So their Jesus makes mistakes apparently. Versus thankfully the real Jesus doesn't make any mistakes.
hmm,
Yeah. Okay. Well,
yeah.
cool. Should we talk? What else can we talk about? Let's talk about some of the practices in Korean Christianity, like, for
Yeah.
example, how they pray or things like that. What if you went to a Korean worship service in Korea, what you might see or experience?
Oh yeah. Um, I went to a lot of English speaking churches, as I was looking for a church early on in 2009, 2010. So I think those churches in Korea, in Seoul, are very similar to some of the setups that you see in the States.
Hmm.
But I think that, Onity is one church that I visited, Covenant Presbyterian Church. There's a lot of positives, in regards to those pockets that I was discussing before. So, if
Yep.
someone's listening here, if you're looking for a church, I would definitely recommend Covenant Presbyterian Church. Pastor Jay, I think it started as an English ministry first. And Yunlin Church has a lot of pastors at that church.
Mm.
And, the teaching is pretty solid. I was very encouraged by that. My wife was able to get some of Burkhoff. They're teaching through Burkhoff systematic theology. Um,
Nice.
they have
Okay.
Puritan Library with a bunch of translated works from a Brockle to
Good.
William Perkins, and so
Yeah.
yes, there are those kind of pockets of
Hmm.
of encouragement where
Hmm.
the gospel is the overall diet is pretty good for the congregants,
Hmm.
um, but I think in regards to worship, our worship at Yunlin, um, it's not like high liturgy like covenant, right? I would
Hmm.
say you have it's very particular about the order, about the liturgy. At
Yeah.
Young, it's pretty simple, and so we don't have a praise band that goes up there. We don't have a choir, and Namjoon Kim, who's one of the head pastors, he has different theological reasons for that, right? And so hymns, mostly hymns, but not much of the Psalms. And so that's the experience that I get from Yunlin. Very simple, and
Okay.
it's have an order. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if people went to a Korean service, one of the things they might see that's different from an American service, for example, would be that when they pray, oftentimes they're all praying at the same time.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't know if your church does that, but most Korean churches do that. And, this is some sort of idea that it encourages people to hear other people praying out loud, that somehow gives other people who are praying at the same time, encouragement. Now, when I experience that, it's hard for me to pray because I can't concentrate.
Mm.
But for
Yeah.
Koreans, they seem to derive energy from, or like encouragement, I suppose is the way to put it, from hearing other people pray and then encouraging themselves to pray more fervently. And of course, they have their early Sebyakido, right?
That's
Like,
right. I was going to mention that
yeah,
early prayer.
like,
Yeah.
yeah. You want to explain what that is briefly?
Yeah, I think for the staff, it's definitely encouraged to go to morning prayer. I think it's either at 5:30 a.m. in the morning every day,
Hmm.
And so that's where the pastors, are preaching the word, preaching the gospel. And so even in my Korean American church in the States, in San Diego, they had that too every day, right? I
Hmm.
didn't go to it, but I remember at seminary school, Joel Kim, he said there are some things that you could learn from the Korean church in regards to the importance of prayer,
Yeah.
praying often and things like that. I also think it could go. I think prayer is very important, and I think I had a discussion with you about this, Jonathan, right? In prayer in
Hmm.
the Korean church, but I also think it could be a little bit of um, legalistic too. There's some legalistic tendencies and such
Yeah.
like that. For me, I grew up in the quiet time guilt kind of thing, in the '90s,
Hmm.
where you know um, so this quiet time guilt. So I do have some sensitivities in regards to morning prayer and things like that.
Hmm.
So I think we are definitely 100%. We are commanded to pray, and we are to pray often without ceasing. The time of prayer, though, whether you pray at 5 a.m. or 8 a.m. or 3 p.m., I think there is Christian liberty in regards to that. So not being, you could sometimes we could think in the Korean setting, not everyone,
Hmm.
but it could come out as if, um, does am I a better Christian if I go to morning prayer every
Hmm.
day? So we could kind of use it as a badge of honor, right?
Yeah.
Saying, because I went to morning prayer, I didn't skip. Because I didn't skip on offering, those kind of things, how much I pay in the offering.
Hmm.
This adds in a way to my righteous standing before the Lord, and we should never go never go in that direction, right? We should
Yeah.
discourage it actually and stuff. Not
Yes.
saying that offering or prayer, those things are wrong. Of course not. We are to do
Hmm.
that as Christians, but yeah.
Yep. Yep. That's right. Good. Well, thank you for sharing about that. Why don't
Mhm.
we talk about your dissertation? Well, your thesis topic.
Mhm.
And so you did your thesis on something related to William Perkins,
Yeah.
who've already said was kind of like a father of the Puritans. And so, can you explain more about that?
Yeah, no problem. I was thinking about, I knew we were going to talk about Korea. I knew that we're going to talk about Perkins. So how could we connect both of them, right? Make a nice segue. And
There
so
you go.
I was listening to a lecture a few years ago by Sinclair Ferguson. It was actually the first. It was the first conference
Hmm.
that was held by PRTS on William Perkins, right? And in the introduction, he mentioned South Korea, and I was like, "Whoa, what does William Perkins have to do with South Korea?" Right? And so, um, and then I found it. I found it in a book here. I want to kind of read it to you. The conference
Per-
lecture. Yeah,
Perkins was actually Korean. That's the
a lot
tie.
of kimchi, right? Yeah, influence. Yeah,
He loved kimchi, right?
um, there's a biblical scholar. I think he was like a Hebrew scholar. His first name is David, and his
Uh-huh.
last name is Kimchi. So I did like a double take. I was like, "What? David?" His first name was David. Remember his first name correct. Well, anyway, I want to read you a couple paragraphs. It's not too long of Sinclair's Ferguson's experience with Korea and William Perkins, and so he says. Uh, in the autumn of 1990, I found myself in the office of a seminary professor in Seoul, South Korea.
Mhm.
He left briefly for an appointment. Glancing over his packed bookshelves, my eyes fell on a set of three hefty tomes. I immediately guessed what they were, but I thought, how is it possible? But yes, there stood the massive three-volume folio set of the works of William Perkins. They looked as though they had been freshly rebound. I did not dare open them for fear of being caught snooping. But how could a set of have been found in its? How could a set of Perkins have found its way to South Korea? My friend soon returned to be greeted by the question: how on earth did you manage to obtain a folio set of Perkins? He responded with a slight smile. Would you like a set? That is a dangerous question to be asked in the Far East when you have just admired someone's possessions. You may find yourself being immediately presented with the admired object. To admire a tie would be one thing, but not a set of Perkins. I tried to respond in an unnuanced a tone as possible. Like a set? It would be insane not to like a set. He said, I could get you a set for $90. He paid a mysterious visit somewhere near the seminary, and I returned home with a newly minted reproduction of the three folio volumes, all for $90. Had I thought of it, I could have set myself up as Perkins Exports Incorporated, probably RHB, right? And made an attractive profit as an importer. I mention this to illustrate the enduring and even expanding impact of the ministry of William Perkins in a part of the world far distant from Cambridge, England, 4 centuries after his death. He is still preaching. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I thought that was a wonderful excerpt from Sinclair.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really
Yeah,
that's a fun story for
yeah.
sure. Cool. Well, so what is distinctive about Williams Perkins, his theology and his life? I mean, maybe you can tell us a little bit, a sketch of his life, first of
Yeah,
all.
yeah, no problem. William Perkins was born in 1558 to Thomas and Hannah Perkins, and he died in 1602. How he died was very tragic, and also it just happened. He died at 44 from kidney stones, and
Hmm.
a historian named Thomas Fuller, in a work called The Holy State, said that when he was dying of kidney stones, he was crying out to the Lord for mercy. And so
That
um,
sounds like a really bad way to die, and I didn't know you could die from that.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
during that. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, people call Owen the Prince of Puritanism. Uh, Perkins would be the father of Puritanism. And
Hmm.
so, uh, I think it's best to understand, the context of William Perkins. He was Elizabethan, right? So he was an Elizabethan Puritan, and
Hmm.
so um, he learned under Lawrence Chatterton. He lived, I think, till the year 90, right? And so Lawrence Chatterton was a devout Protestant, had a lot of polemics against the Roman Catholics, and so he learned. Perkins learned under him. And so Perkins, I think it's like I said, it's best to understand his political and theological context. This was a time where Queen Elizabeth was a Protestant. You know, not in the Geneva kind of way, right? Where but she was a Protestant, and so lurking in the backgrounds was the Roman Catholics, right, that were trying to take England back to make it Catholic again. And so this is the context of William Perkins. I think Peter Marshall, he calls this the crisis years from 1586 to 1592.
Hmm.
There were actually attempts there were Catholic attempts to assassinate Queen Elizabeth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1588, there was the Spanish Armada.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there were definitely threats where the Catholic religion could come back into Protestant England. But if you look at it, there was also in the 1570s Jesuit missionaries going in and catechizing, right? Catechizing the Protestants and such, the Roman Catholic faith. One man by the name of a Jesuit named by Canonius, he wrote a Catholic catechism that was translated in 1579, right, into English. And so the Catholics are catechizing them. And so this is the theological context that Perkins is at. So it's interesting when you read his writings, especially in volume 2, volume 7, all throughout his the volumes from 1 through 10, RHB just republished it. You have this sense of great urgency, where he's telling his students, right? Stop reading the Roman Catholics. Stop reading them. Why not read Luther? Why not read Calvin, Vermigli, Butzer? Why not read them? So you see a lot of urgency in his preaching, and in his writings and stuff like that. So he wrote a work called Reformed Catholic, a Reformed Catholic, and this is more going towards my thesis. And so in my thesis, I want to ask the questions, why did Perkins defend the doctrine of justification, and how did he do it, right? And so hopefully, my thesis answers those questions. But if you take a look at a Reformed Catholic, I made an appendix of all the doctrines that he covered, and justification came out to be 17 pages, where he's talking about free will, only 7 pages. But the doctrine of justification for William Perkins was what he called the foundation of the Church of England. So if the Roman Catholics were to take up the Church of England again, and we let go of this doctrine of justification, the Church of England cannot stand. So so that was, in a sense, part of the thesis of the work.
Okay. I mean, what did he mean by Reformed Catholic? Because I think a lot of people hear those two words together and it sounds like oil and water. It doesn't seem to a lot of people don't think they go together. So what did he mean by a Reformed Catholic?
Yeah, so what he meant by Reformed Catholic was, that I believe he meant Catholic with a lowercase c rather than an uppercase c. So he's not talking about Roman Catholicism, but he's talking about what the universal church has believed, in regards to the Trinity, Christology. Perkins was huge on Augustine, he loved Augustine. And he also had a work going through the church fathers, and seeing the continuum of Protestant theology with the earlier fathers, and so that's what he means by Reformed Catholic. He's saying that Protestantism is not a sect, but that that Protestants are in continuation with the tradition that we have from the early fathers to the new, back all the way back to the New Testament.
Yeah.
That's what he means by Reformed Catholic. And so I think he would also say, I think the substance of what he would say is that we own the word Catholic, right? Because after the Council of Trent, the Roman Catholics should be seen as a 16th century sect, basically, after the Council of Trent. So we should be the ones that have that term Catholic, universal faith, and the analogy of faith, going back to the Apostles' Creed, the Council of Nicaea, Chalcedon.
Yeah, makes sense. So, what precisely was your regarding William Perkins? What precisely was your thesis about?
Oh yeah, so my thesis was regards to how William Perkins defended the doctrine of justification. So in what ways did he do it? So reading his works, I wanted William Perkins to speak on his own terms, and to not to say anything that he didn't say, and then getting him in his historical context was really important too. Why was he saying it? Because as I mentioned, in regards to the crisis years and stuff like that. So it was, and then the second part of the thesis was basically how he did it. And so, in regards to how he did it was one of the themes that came out over and over throughout the volumes was this outside of us and inside of us language, right? And so when he's speaking about inside of us, he's speaking about sanctification, the work of the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
When you're talking about outside of us, you're speaking about the objective work of Christ and his active and passive obedience. In a sense, how we are clothed with the righteousness of Christ unto everlasting life. And so he makes this distinction over and over again. So one of the questions I asked was, why is he making this distinction? Well, he finds it in the scriptures for sure. And then it's a tool in his polemics as he interacts with Bellarmine, interacts with Stapleton, and the Jesuits like Canonius, where he saw that the Roman Catholics were not distinguishing between justification and sanctification, but in fact that they were, in a sense, his words were mixing them. And then as you're justified and as you're sanctified, as and the Holy Spirit's work in you, you mix all that together, and then you have a final justification at the end. That's how he saw the Roman, he would call them papists. He would call them their articulation of justification was that. So he was interacting with that, with this inside and outside distinction. And then in the work, I try to trace that, right? To trace the origins of this inside and outside distinction, that it wasn't just in Perkins, but we see it in Vermigli, we see it later on in Owen, we see it early on in Luther and Calvin, and even in our Westminster Standards, this inside and outside of us distinction. And that was one of one of the main tools that he used in his polemics against the Roman Catholics.
Okay.
And so there's a chapter to that I think that's chapter 3. And then I go on, and then another tool that he uses is the law-gospel distinction. And so he distinguishes between what the law is, what the gospel is. He has a very strong third use of the law. And then with his law-gospel distinction, you could see it in his exegesis of James chapter 2, and his inside and outside of outside distinction as well. And then the third tool that he uses is causality, right? And so he uses that in regards to causality, and that's more focused on, I think, it's the 5th chapter on final judgment, justification and final judgment. And so those are the 3 tools that he uses as he brings them out through his exegesis of Holy Writ.
Okay. Now, William Perkins was 16th century, right? So there's a development of terminology once you get into the 17th century Protestant scholastics and beyond. So I'm curious, when he's discussing justification, does he use the terminology of imputation?
Oh, yes. Yeah. He uses that terminology, imputation. Yeah, you see it in the works, and he makes some analogies to merchants, and in regards to crediting and things like that. But I've been reading Owen as well. I read his volume 5. I think Owen is more on that, more on the imputation.
Developed a bit more, yeah.
Yeah. In regards to the imputation of the righteousness of Christ, and you see the imputation of Adam's sin more in Owen than you would see in Perkins. But in regards to the imputation of righteousness, you see it in both Owen and Perkins. Yeah.
Okay. And how about, and I'm curious, maybe since your thesis was on justification, so you may not have, you probably didn't delve into all of his all the parts of his theology, but
Mhm.
it's somewhat connected to justification. But I'm curious if you found his, because Puritans were known for a specific view of the Mosaic covenant, and so I'm wondering if he addressed the issue of the covenant works, or and and his understanding of the Mosaic covenant as a covenant of grace or covenant of works. And did you find anything in his work about that as you were writing your thesis?
Yeah, I was that's chapter 4 in regards to the law gospel distinction,
Hmm.
because Perkins, he would see that the law, uh, okay, so I worked more with the Adamic covenant of works, right? Because
Okay.
there are some things in the secondary literature that I did not agree with whatsoever,
Okay.
and I'm going to explain that a little bit later. I didn't touch too much on the republication of the covenant of works. I didn't
Hmm.
touch too much on that in the thesis. But if I'm going to later update the thesis, I would add some more of that. I was focusing more about the secondary literature on the Adamic covenant of works, which
Mm,
Perkins definitely held to, this Adamic covenant of works. And
yes.
so I put it in the 4th chapter in regards to his law gospel distinction. And he says things like this: the covenant of works is the law,
Hmm.
and the covenant of grace is the gospel. You
Okay.
know, with
You
direct,
know,
yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah.
we're going to get kicked off here in
Oh,
a few seconds because I only have a basic Zoom program. But
yeah.
we have 15 seconds left, and I just want to say thank you so much for being on the podcast, and it was wonderful to talk to you. And perhaps we can do a part B sometime. But
Yeah, yeah, definitely.